Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are so happy to have you join us. First, happy Celiac Awareness Month. We are so happy you're here with us this evening, and we're going to have a discussion on celiac research. And we have two, well, we have our amazing team with us, but we have Lindsay Yackel who put this awesome event together, and we have one of our final farewells with one of our awesome student interns, Rebecca, with us, Dr. Verma, who is our chief of pediatric gastroenterology and our medical director here at the Celiac Disease Center. That was a really simplified introduction for Dr. Verma. She holds a lot of other hats, and I think a lot of you know who she is, but we're so happy to have her with us. And the star of our evening, we are so excited to have Dr. Valerie Abadie with us. She is a research associate professor here at the University of Chicago in our Department of Medicine, section of gastroenterology. And for those of you who don't know Dr. Abadie, she is internationally recognized for her expertise in immunology and celiac disease. And she has done so much amazing work contributing to increasing our understanding of celiac disease pathogenesis. I'm going to let her talk a little bit about when Dr. Abadie speaks. Sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, what is she? She has so much going on, but you know, our amazing mouse model. Dr. Abadie is involved in so many of those things. But I thought to get us started, and before I want to go through some housekeeping. I get excited, you guys. I want to jump to like the beginning of this, but please use at the bottom, we have a Q&A function. Please enter questions, but more importantly, if you want to participate, we want interaction. This is for you guys to better understand what's giving you a glimpse into what's happening in celiac research. And Dr. Verma will be on with us too, lending her insight. I'm excited because in just a week or so, Digestive Disease Week, DDW, a huge conference where we gather researchers and clinicians from all over the country to share the latest in celiac disease and care will be happening. And so that's another wonderful place where people exchange ideas from all over the globe. But I want to encourage you to please add in your questions and we'll pause. And we want this to be as interactive as possible. This really is for you. If you don't understand something that we're talking about, say it in the Q&A and say, can you explain this a little bit further? Before Dr. Verma, I hand it over to Dr. Abadie, is there anything you want to add?
No, we're all going to learn together. And I think that even if you want to go off your mic and want to speak, go ahead. I think unmute yourself. This is really interactive, and there's no question that is not the most important question for this evening. So fire away.
Yes. So without further ado, I am excited to bring Dr. Abadie up. And Dr. Abadie is going to give us a little bit of basics on research because I don't ever want to assume we all know all the different types of research. And then she's going to explain a little bit about her work here at University of Chicago, and we'll go from there. So be sure to use that Q&A. Thanks, guys. And thank you, Dr. Abadie.
All right. Hi, everyone. So what would be wonderful is that actually I see you because, I'm not going to give a talk with slide and everything. I'm just going to talk to you. So if you guys can put your camera on and, like that, if you ask me a question, I'm actually going to see you, and that's going to be much more convivial like that. So I have a French accent, so hopefully you're going to understand also everything that I'm saying. Otherwise, do not hesitate, to ask and make me repeat. That's going to be great. Yeah. Thank you for putting your camera on. It's going to be much more interactive and it's nicer, you know, because it feels always a bit weird to speak in front of a screen. So yeah, so I've been asked to ask a little bit of what's going on in the field of celiac disease research. So first of all, I think when we can start with is like you can approach research in a different way. There's basic research, which what I'm doing. I'm a basic scientist. I work on the bench. I'm not in contact with patient. I work with samples from patient. I work also with animal models, and the basic scientists really try to understand what's going on. So in the case of celiac disease, we really trying. There's different way of approaching it, but on my end, I'm an immunologist, so I'm trying to understand why do we have dysregulation of the immune response in the gut when we eat gluten. So that's a basic question that we're trying to address. So I'm looking at it on the length of the immune cells, really looking at how the immune cells in the gut interact. So I'm trying to say it in lay term, and other people, other basic scientists will work rather, you know, on the microbe side. So looking at how common cell bacteria, which are the bacteria that populate the intestine, can impact the immune response that is induced to gluten. There's this line of research that is also done. Other people are actually going to look at how some of these bacteria that are in the gut can actually interact with gluten and make the gluten peptide more harmful for the host, for you guys. So that's the side of basic science where you can, you know, look at different things, but really on the side of the host and using more models. And there's more translational research. So that's something we will do. It's always called bench to bedside, where you're going to try to bridge the knowledge you gain in the lab to the patients, to you guys. And that's going to be through project whereby you could have, let's say, I'm just going to give an example that doesn't necessarily apply to celiac, but you would have identify something in the lab that you think is very important to induce the disease, and then you're going to go check, you know, in the patient whether this is true, or you're going to find a treatment and you're going to try this treatment, you know, in patient and figure it out what it does, you know. Whether patient is going to do better before and after treatment, and actually what is the on my hand, because I'm an immunologist, what the immune mechanism that can explain whether this treatment is working well or not. So that's more translational research that we're bridging both basic science and clinical science. So so I think that's the main two type of big research area that you would have. So at the University of Chicago, what we do is that because we most immunology, and what has really driven us all these years is really trying to understand why you do not tolerate gluten when you eat it. And we have approached this initially with mouse model. So, and along the way, what we have trying to understand is you guys have inflammation in the gut. We have tried to understand why this inflammation that you have prevent you from being tolerant to gluten. And we have identified some compounds that are produced in the gut that interfere with the ability of gluten to be tolerated, and that actually contributed to further enhance the inflammation that you have in the gut. And based on this work, we actually, as Rachel said, develop a mouse model of celiac disease. So this is a mouse who expressed the same inflammatory mediator that 75% of the celiac disease patient express. This mediator is called interleukin-15. And these mice also have a genetic predisposing gene, which is HLA-DQ8, because you guys must know that all of you who develop celiac disease express either HLA-DQ2 or HLA-DQ8. That's a predisposing gene that all celiac disease patients have. So these mice had this these two components that we'll find in human celiac patient. And then we have developed this mouse model and study it to try to understand then what is required for the disease to be induced. And we have identified, for example, that transglutaminase 2 that you must know because in celiac disease patients develop antibody against this protein. So transglutaminase 2 activation is required, for instance, for the development of disease. And we also have identified that many cell types, so that are called lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, and B lymphocytes are important for celiac disease development. And currently what we are doing is we're taking a step further and trying really to understand. So we know that these B lymphocytes are important. B lymphocytes are these cells that because they can secrete antibodies. And I always give the example of COVID, because during the COVID pandemics, everybody heard about antibodies, right? That the antibodies are important to protect against pathogens, and the cells that produce and secrete these antibodies are called B lymphocytes. But beside this role as antibody-producing cells, these cells can do other things. They can really interact with other cells of the immune systems and actually have more detrimental roles, harmful roles. So we're really trying to understand now what these cells do in the context of celiac disease. And we know they produce antibodies. We don't think that antibodies play a real role in the pathogenesis, but we do believe that these cells actually contribute to interact with many other cell types and contribute to build on this pathogenic response that we see that leads actually to tissue damage in the gut. So that's what we do. And at the same time, we do a bit of translational research in the sense that we actually using samples from patients. So when you come to do an endoscopy to get screened or to get a follow-up on a disease, the physician takes some biopsy of the gut. So little punch, it's really little amount of tissue in the guts. And this gut is sent to pathology, where the pathologist is going to look at it, stain, cut, put it on the slide and stain to figure out whether you have celiac disease or not, whether your intestinal tissue is damaged or not. So what do we do is that when the physician do the endoscopy, we ask a few of these biopsy that allow us actually to really study how are these cells in the gut in the lab. So on my hand, we're looking really at B cells, whether you have some B cell that have a weird profile that can be actually harmful for you. So that's the main line of research currently. So I think that gives you an overview of what we are doing and what other labs in the world are doing.
That's awesome. Thank you, Dr. See, I almost said Valerie.
You can say Valerie.
Dr. Abadie, thank you. You guys, this is definitely down to the molecular level of how you look at celiac disease. And I know it can be, sometimes confusing, but it's really important to understand that we're always looking at the different ways. What's neat is when you go with Dr. Abadie and you look at the mouse models, they're really looking and mimicking how your body responds to gluten and if there is damage. And we are also doing a study looking at brain fog, and we're doing that with our pediatric patients and adult patients. I don't know, do any of you guys know what brain fog is? Do you we use that word, but I don't know. Does anyone know what that is? I'd love someone could get off mute and tell me what you think brain fog. There aren't wrong answers at all. Clearly, look at the way I'm talking. But does anyone experience maybe something they think might be brain fog?
I think brain fog is one of my symptoms when I get gluten exposure. I guess kind of what it is like it starts affecting the way your brain kind of works, in the sense that for me, it's that I start getting kind of forgetful if I'm taking a test. Like I have trouble focusing and recalling information from past things. So it's kind of like this almost like this clouded sense of judgment and memory and perception.
That's a great definition.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a great definition. And so what we are doing, it looks a little different for a pediatric study. And Dr. Verma, I'm going to call on you in a second to explain a little bit about the difference. But in our adult study, it is a very controlled gluten challenge. And you take a very, very small amount. And so what we are looking at is we do an fMRI as well as neurological testing. And we kind of take a look at when you do it 2 days in a row, and they can actually, they're measuring to see if there is an effect when your body ingests gluten and if it triggers a long response of people are having what we have recognized as there is a short response, like someone who immediately experiences brain fog. And then there is a delayed response, which is usually like a day, or Anya, as you're saying, it could affect you for a few days, or for some people, a few weeks if they've gotten gluten before. And so we are really looking at that measurement. And then in our pediatric population, we are looking at things a little differently. And I feel like Dr. Verma can probably explain it way better than me. So I might put her on the spot just to explain our pediatric brain fog study right now and what's happening. And maybe Dr. Verma, you can even take a nod at just explaining pediatric studies with celiac disease and what that looks like.
So I think, there are so many different facets in pediatrics and in adult medicine with celiac disease. I mean, there's so many things that can be done. But when we thought about looking at brain fog, it was really, this is a symptom that has been felt by patients, but not necessarily always recognized by the medical community that it is part of celiac disease. So one of the things to look at is it truly, there's something going on in your brain that gives you those symptoms, or there's nothing going on in your brain and you have the symptoms? And is there something on an immunological level that is giving you those symptoms? So you can, first of all, validate that exposure to gluten gives you these symptoms. There's a change in the brain in a functional MRI. So the MRI that's done looking at your brain is a functional MRI. And then in pediatrics, we're also looking at the EEG to see if there are any changes in the different waves and spikes that are looked at by the neurologist. And then there's a neuropsych evaluation that's done, and we monitor and see. So that's the first thing, is to really be able to validate, do you get a structural functional change that happens when you eat gluten and you have these symptoms? And then the second thing that we wanted to know from a pediatric standpoint is, how long does it take to actually get better on the gluten-free diet? Or do you ever get better with the brain fog on a gluten-free diet? Are your symptoms getting better? Does the MRI changes in the brain get better? Are the EEG changes getting better or not? So again, validating some of these things and hopefully being able to predict in the future that if you have brain fog and you're on a gluten-free diet, how long is it going to take to get better? Or is there no way to predict? So the idea for pediatrics was children who had the symptoms, and that's what brought them to get the blood test done for celiac disease. That's what brought them to get the endoscopy done. We would then enroll those children and then follow them over time. At the time of diagnosis, before going on a gluten-free diet, what are all these changes? And then over time, 3 months, 6 months, and so on, to see if it makes a difference. And is there a difference if you get on some vitamins or not? Or maybe there's nothing that can help. Or we can tell you, if you get exposed, it'll take X number of days. Or when you get diagnosed, it'll take 3 months, 6 months, or so on for things to get better. So that was the basis behind the pediatric trial. So there was not any exposure to gluten, but it was at the time of diagnosis. And with the adults, there's a small exposure. And I know as soon as we talk about, oh my God, you've got to eat gluten for a clinical trial, all of us are worried and concerned. But we also know, looking at these studies, that these effects are not long-term. It's a one sort of gluten load that you get, and then those effects go away over time. And we know that the body changes, and Dr. Abadie can tell a little bit more about that. What happens when you get exposed to gluten? Is it a short term? Is it okay to have those challenges done? under a controlled situation. Because again, as patients, none of us want to get exposed to gluten because we are told by everyone, don't get exposed to gluten. And now we say, have some gluten so we can have this study done. So Dr. Abadie, what do you think in terms of reassurance, concerns, those kind of things?
Yeah, so there are different type of study where patient needs to be gluten challenged. And first and foremost, I mean, for us, it's actually very important because it's like that we can really see what is induced by gluten. So we know that there's a lot of constraint associated with it for the patient. But as Dr. Verma said, we really try to minimize, the impact that it has. So the gluten challenge that is used for brain fog is actually a very transient one because it's just a one dose gluten exposure. What we know from an immunological standpoint is that very rapidly when you ingest gluten, you're going to have in the body what is called cytokine release. So cytokine are these little inflammatory mediator or immune mediators that are important for inducing an immune response. So we know what we can detect in the blood, actually, some of the cytokines that actually an indicator of your body is responding to the gluten challenge, because that what it means is that cells that have seen gluten before a long time ago that we call memory cells are recalled. They know that the antigen, what we call antigen, is the bad guy. The bad protein entered your body again, and these cells are recalled, and then they're going to try, to respond to this insult. So we know that with just one dose of gluten, like it's done in the gluten challenge for brain fog, that's transient. It appears at 2 hours post gluten injection, and actually it's going to go down. And just this short exposure wouldn't induce any damage to your gut. For other studies where we have to put the patient on a prolonged time with gluten, you could actually have a bit of damage in your gut. But we also know that this is going to actually disappear as soon as you're going to get back on a gluten-free diet. So Ritu, to answer the question, I think it's really different from one study to the other one. Just that you guys know that it's actually very beneficial for research to be able to do that, despite the constraint we know and the fear that can be, that can happen on your side. But really, for the brain fog study, it's really a very short impact. Then the impact can be like if you have brain fog, you might develop one of these symptoms. And as Dr. Verma said, then the MRI and the tests that are performed are going to provide us actually with some clues on what's going on. What is dysregulated and what gluten is doing to cerebral functions.
So, I mean, it is scary to get the gluten on, but again, it's one of those things that is pretty safe in the sense that it's not causing long-term issues, and you're not going to be on this gluten for weeks or months on end. And it helps in many ways. So one is with the brain fog study, we look at the brain and so on. And then it also, a lot of these challenges that are being done for different studies. Right now, I know everyone knows that there's a TTG test that we do. We have tissue transglutaminase as the blood work. But based on some of these trials and studies, we also know that there are other cytokines that can be looked at. And maybe one of the things we're learning is that you don't need to have a gluten challenge for 6, 7, 9 weeks. There might be a shorter challenge that you can do. So there's a lot more to learn with different testing that can be done. And then, of course, medications and trials like that. So scary it is. But it is something that is done in a safe manner so that no one is hurt on a bigger level. But I think I'd love to hear from you guys, all the children, young adults, teens. What questions do you have? I mean, talk about your fears, talk about concerns, questions. This is the forum. This is, as we've all said, this is not something that you should be shy about. I am sure you have questions. So come on, somebody can come on. Natalie, I'm going to call on you. Let's go.
Hey, what was the question?
Question, comment, anything.
I think that all the research is fascinating. I'm really interested to hear about it, especially from such beautiful, lovely scientists. But, one thing that I'm curious about is how people like us can get involved with these studies, because I know they're probably centralized to specific locations like Chicago, and you know, because you guys do all the research, doing crazy things.
So, you know, there are many other centers, big centers as well, that you can, you know, whichever center is closest to you. But one way you can do is you can send out, you know, you can send a question out to Rachel and she can work through a network of other centers as well. Or we can tell you what you're interested in. And there are many other centers as well besides ours that do research. So it shouldn't limit you if you're not in Chicago. It should not limit you from joining a different research initiatives. And it's not just, you know, gluten challenge. There are many, many other research initiatives as well that are out there. Even as Dr. Abadie mentioned, when you get an endoscopy done, the biopsies that are taken, there's a lot of things that Dr. Abadie does with those biopsies, even though we get the results and then we get a couple extra, which is not harmful to you because your intestine heals. You take that biopsy, it's like a little scrape. You take the biopsy, some of it is used for diagnosis. And if there's an extra one or two that you're willing to give when you have an endoscopy done, Dr. Abadie can do wonders with that in terms of learning so many different things. I know that we were talking earlier about looking at other conditions along with celiac disease. And maybe we can have Dr. Abadie talk a little bit about what does she do with those biopsies, looking at them.
Yeah, I mean, so now I don't know if you guys learn about there's a bunch of new techniques in research. We call them high throughput technique, which actually allows us to study immune cell at a single cell level. So basically, you're gonna take a biopsy, which is a tissue. We can dissociate these cells and look into each individual cells and look what they are. So we have different techniques. We can do what we call flow cytometry, which allow to look at the surface of those cells, and then we can characterize those cells based on what they express on the surface, and that can help us say, for example, this is a gluten-specific cells, that a cell that actually recognize gluten, or a transglutaminase specific cell, so cell that can recognize transglutaminase. And then these cells express this receptor. So sometimes it's receptor that one would expect, and sometimes actually in an autoimmune condition or inflammatory condition, is going to be a receptor or protein that we wouldn't expect. And then they're going to have a meaning, you know. It means that, you know, they can then be pathogenic. They can contribute to secrete bad products. So we can, like that, characterize. Then we can do the same, take the tissue dissociated and do what we call single cell RNA sequencing, that we go inside the cells and look at the level of nucleic acid to try to understand what is the genetic program of those cells, what these cells, and then that gives a lot of information because we can understand not only what the cell do, but what they can do, and in what what we call immune pathway they can contribute to. So let's say I know in celiac disease there's inflammation. I can go look at which cell subset can contribute to this inflammation because he's going to have an inflammatory program. So we can do this thing. And then the technology has much advanced, like in the past 5 years, it's been crazy. Now we're actually thinking about doing that now. We're going to be able to take just the biopsy, just the tissue, and actually do these techniques on the tissue. So not only we're going to know what is the program of these cells, but we actually are going to be able to say, where are these cells? Which is awesome because in celiac disease, you know, you can have celiac lesions that are patchy. You can have tissue damage in one side of a tissue and not on the other side. And so we're going to be able to see what are the cells that are most associated with this tissue damage. So that's kind of the new stuff that we're gonna embark on and do. And like Dr. Verma said, not only are we interested in celiac disease, but we're also becoming interested also in co-association between celiac disease and esophagitis or other food allergies, because there's, I mean, many children actually coming into consulting, right, with like allergy to many things and inflammation to many food component and dietary antigens. And we want to try to understand why, you know, and whether there's a common denominator between all these allergy or intolerance. So I do that because we don't know how we can classify yet this condition, but all, you know, this inability to tolerate some dietary, I mean, some food components, basically.
So not only do we learn more about celiac disease, but also be able to help other inflammatory conditions through these techniques to learn through that. But I guess one big question, though, Dr. Abadie, is can we get to a stage where we can know why, besides the genetic factors and so on, what is it that we could do that would prevent celiac disease from happening? I know we talk about medications and those are down the pipeline, but tell us, someone is genetically susceptible, eating gluten, what can they do that would prevent this from happening? Where are you with that?
Yeah, so that's a very difficult question because, so as I told you initially, you have every single celiac disease patient is genetically predisposed. He has this gene called HLA-DQ2 or DQ8, but 40% of the general population actually carry the same genes, and yet only 1% of the individuals are going to went on to develop celiac disease. So it means that other factors beside the genetics and beside gluten are contributing to the disease. So that's when we talk, you know, that's why we talk about complex inflammatory disorder. Complex meaning that it's just genetic, it's the gluten, and it's also other environmental factor that must be involved. So when you talk about the environment, it can be anything, you know, it can be at large, it can be pollutants, you know, it can be smoking, it can be viral infection, it can be bacterial infection, it can be everything that is in our surrounding and that can, you know, affect us basically. So the studies that have been done in recent years have focused more of the influence on viral infection, for instance, because there was an association with the incidence of gastroenteritis with the onset of celiac disease, and this association with some virus, most common virus involved in gastroenteritis, such as rotavirus or norovirus, and this onset of celiac. And it has been shown for also other autoimmune disorders in animal models of disease that infecting these animal models with these viruses could precipitate development of the disease. So we do believe that there must be some pathogen for some patient who might trigger the disease. So this patient are predisposed, and there's EAT, you know, it's a multi-EAT disease, and then this EAT provided by this pathogen that promote the disease. So in that context, one could think that, you know, vaccinated children with Rotarix, which is the vaccine against rotavirus, might help, hopefully, to prevent the development of disease. We have no proof of that. I'm just saying what we're thinking might happen, but more studies need to be done. And then in that case, more clinical studies to prove that. But that's what have emerged in recent years. Then to kind of extend the question and said, what can we do then so that's where the research is going, trying to identify what are other triggers that we can actually implement something to prevent. But prevention is actually is still very hard because, for example, I told you I've been working on this cytokine, which is interleukin-15, which is a strong inflammatory mediator, and we do not know yet what triggers IL-15 production in the gut. So till we don't know the trigger, we can't prevent. So apart from viral infection that's coming in mind now, I don't know of anything else at the moment that could help. I mean, research in the field of celiac disease is also working on modifying grains, simply. So it's totally different line of research from what we're doing, but engineering gluten protein that are not going to be harmful. So really trying to remove, so the gluten protein contains some amino acids, so some constituent that favor their immunogenicity, so their ability to be harmful. So some biochemists are trying to remove this amino acid that when you eat gluten, gonna induce an immune response. That would be another way of preventing the disease, because you won't be eating something that is harmful for you. Something, and then going more in prevention. So that's more, that's a bit different way, but a lot of studies are being done now to use some enzyme called glutenase that can actually so let's say, so it's actually in clinical trials. So we haven't talked about clinical trials also, which is also a way or you guys can be involved. So these glutenase are like little compounds that you could eat before having a meal, where you don't know whether it's going to contain gluten or not. And this little enzyme can degrade the gluten that is still present. That would allow you to, so that's not going to prevent the disease, that's not going to cure the disease, but that's going to allow you to go to restaurants and be able to have a normal meal without fearing of being contaminated. So this is actually in probably in phase 2 now, phase one clinical trial for safety and tolerability in several institutions. When patients have a control meal that contain gluten, and prior to having this meal, they eat this glutenase, and the level of gluten contamination is evaluated after that. So that's one of the promising, I mean, it's, yeah, therapeutic intervention. We can't call that therapy, but we certainly can call it therapeutic intervention that should improve your life, if I can say. So, you know, we're going in all directions.
There are many directions to
Yes,
celiac
and
disease.
there are a lot.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think that's the approach that, you have to take, because you just don't know, which, as we have discoveries, and whether it's healing or diagnostics or therapeutics like this, where you could go out, or a vaccine. I think there are so many pathways where so many researchers are looking. And Dr. Verma, I want to bridge back really quick to our brain fog study, because we got a great question here about ADD and ADHD. Can it be confused as brain fog, or vice versa?
I think the symptoms for in some people, especially if you have ADD, the symptoms can be confused with brain fog. Absolutely. So that's another reason why we need to do these studies, to know, is there a difference in people who have brain fog alone on exposure to gluten, or is this ADD, ADHD, and therefore therapies would be slightly different or very different if you have those conditions. But symptoms can be very similar for some people.
And I know that was something we recently were somewhere, and it's definitely come up that ADHD, there seems to be a connection. I now have the question of what is the connection between ADHD potentially, or ADD, and celiac disease. Is there a connection? And I'm just saying it's come up a few times recently, and it would be interesting to see if this. I know Dr. Abadie was just speaking about how they're looking at more studies, when they look at tissue cells and everything, the correlation of other autoimmune diseases. This is something very different, a neurological disorder, but it would be interesting to see if more research comes from that.
I think you need to almost look at multi-centers. It's like going back many, many, many years. We did not know that there was this association with type 1 diabetes and celiac, right? So now we know that there is. And how did we know? I mean, obviously it's clinical research, multi-centers. You're looking at that. You're studying patients who have this. So you literally need patients who have diagnosis of ADD or ADHD, whichever one it is, or all of them, and then do screening labs and see, do you find an association or not, or you do particular, other kind of testing that you would do. It's, again, just like short stature. I mean, we know 5 to 10% of those children end up with celiac disease as well. And the only way you learn that is by exploring and research and multi-center studies and so on, and having people with those particular conditions go through testing for celiac disease. Then going. And I think the reason that question keeps coming on is because we have children and adults who have celiac disease who have symptoms that are very similar. We call it brain fog, but they are similar to that. So we hope that those who have something else that a gluten-free diet might help, or they may have celiac disease or not. But there has been nothing proven for sure that everyone who has ADHD or ADD is going to get better on a gluten-free diet.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to first have the diagnosis and then work together with your teams to see whether.
Yeah. So I want to get to, you bring up a great point about multi-centers, and Dr. Abadie and Dr. Verma, I really do want to talk about the collaborative environment of the celiac research community. But first, we have a question, and I will leave it to either of you. Are there other centers I know that are looking into stem cell treatment, and what research is going on around stem cells and its effect on celiac disease?
I don't know the answer to that. I know there's the answer to that with inflammatory bowel disease, but I don't know if anyone is doing this from a celiac standpoint. I think you need to learn a little bit more about celiac to go down that stem cell, but IBD, yeah.
IBD, yes. I don't think that actually in the field of celiac, people have looked into that yet.
Okay, that's good to know. So, Dr. Abadie, I would love for you to touch upon, because you just had a great collaborative meeting this weekend, multi-centers, and Dr. Verma will look to you next, but multi-centers and around the globe are so important to further research. Can you touch a little bit about how many centers and researchers work together? And how you partner with them and how that works? What does that look like?
Sure. I think, there's different way of doing it, so of partnering. So first of all, the field of celiac disease is quite small, let's say. Everybody knows everybody all over the world. And there's like big team that are a bit disseminated everywhere, and we know what they're doing. Which means that, let's say we have a question and there's something we don't know how to do, but we know that another team had the expertise, we can contact this team and ask them for some help and to collaborate. And that's what we do usually. Instead of spending months, trying to set up something yourself when you know that your neighbors can do it, it's much faster and much more efficient. So in the context of basic science, that's what you will do. You will pool the expertise of several persons to advance faster and better on a project. And we know from studies, so I'm going to give example, I don't know, for the IL-2 release, for example, that Dr. Verma knows. So we know there's a team in Australia who, so that goes back to that conversation. So we know when you eat some gluten, I told you there's cytokine release. And this is team in Australia have investigated that after clinical trials, actually, where they tried a vaccine, and the vaccine didn't didn't succeed as much as it could have been, but a lot of knowledge been gained actually from that studies. In science, there's some failure, but there's always to learn about the failures. And after this essay, they actually noted that there was this peak of cytokine in the blood, which actually indicate that you've been exposed to gluten. And that these cells that have seen gluten before are recalled. And so they have investigated that further, and they are setting up a TED that hopefully they're trying it all over the world now with many teams to try to see if this detection of the cytokine in the blood could be actually used as a monitoring tool for gluten exposure in patients. Which will be fantastic, because you will know, not only when you have become contaminated or when you have celiac disease, just by screening your blood. So that would be a non-invasive new way of monitoring the disease. So this, for instance, is done now in collaboration with many other places in the world where there's bigger center with bigger cohort of patients. So there can be that bridge to also you guys, you can be involved also in many studies, like Dr. Verma said at the beginning, there are other centers throughout the US where some teams, are seeing whether there's some patients are willing, to try. So glutenase, I know that teams, are testing glutenase in Vanderbilt and other places, IL-2 release in Boston. So there's many things to do. So I think that answered the question. Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
really, in this field, not only for basic science where there's something that's a tool or a technique that someone can help you perform, you will collaborate. And then for more clinical studies, it's more like many centers throughout the world are going to join force to have an increased number of patients where you can test your drug, your compound, your treatment, because you need to actually prove in a big number, with a high number of patients that it works.
That's fantastic.
And
Dr. Verma,
many centers have different expertise. So for example, Dr. Abadie has a mouse model. So that's utilized by others for their studies. Other centers that are good
that's a good example. I didn't know.
Right. So I think that when anyone needs anything done with the mouse model, they come to Dr. Abadie. There are other centers that do a lot more with the probiotics or microbiome, whether it's Canada or whether it's Australia or whether it's whatever. So different groups have expertise in different things, but everyone collaborates together because we know that celiac disease is not just going to be one thing. It's not just going to be the T cell or the B cell, or it's going to be just one interleukin. There are probably going to be many other cytokines that are going to come up. So every center has something to offer, and at the end result, to learn much more about the actual disease itself. What can we do to stay healthy, but also what can we do to prevent certain things, or what can we do to monitor? So every year there's learning more in terms of to forward, looking at science in many different ways. So we all work together. It's a small community and working on many, many different aspects of the disease itself.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I have to say that I know for you guys, just know that there are so many groups that collaborate. I feel like everyone is really working together to find a functional cure, a real cure, a better way to diagnose celiac, a better way to understand the cytokine storm in your body. So it's exciting. But Dr. Verma, this came from someone that we can look at this almost from a research perspective, maybe, being diagnosed about, they are checking TTG levels every year, but they are always high. And while, still on a completely gluten-free diet, is there a reason for these high numbers?
I always say there's always a reason, but there are some cases where there isn't a reason. So I think it depends on how high the TTG is. It depends on, did it come down after you went on a gluten-free diet or not? So that's your first question. So if your number was 250 and it stayed there, then you've got to go back and look at what else, because there are other things that can give you a TTG that's elevated as well. There are other autoimmune diseases that cause this. Crohn's disease does. Eosinophilic esophagitis does, there's diabetes does. So there's many other reasons for a TTG to be elevated with other autoimmune diseases. So you have to first see, did it go down? So let's say it went down and then it's kind of stayed there. So how high is it now as compared to the norm for your particular lab? If it continues to be high, then you look at, do you have any oats in your diet? Those are the sort of next things. So no wheat, rye, barley, but are you having any oats, that even if they're certified gluten-free oats, is about 10-20% of people, or maybe even a little higher, who actually get reactions to the oats, even though oats is not gluten, but it does. And so that's the next thing that you look at. And I'm assuming by now you've gone through all the cross-contamination, and this glutenase is not out yet, so we can't get that right now. So you've gone through all that. And then you have an endoscopy done. I think for whatever it's worth, the next thing should be an endoscopy, because you want to see, is there any inflammation in your gut? Is there inflammation in your esophagus? conditions that Dr. Abadie was mentioning about eosinophilic esophagitis. That is a condition where you have inflammation in your esophagus on the basis of food allergies, and that can also give you an elevated TTG. So you need an endoscopy to have your biopsies done, and you make sure that your gastroenterologist does biopsies in the esophagus, the stomach, and your small intestine, regardless of whether it looks normal or not. And that is the key. So it depends on who you're seeing as a GI doctor. So that endoscopy needs to be done. And then if your endoscopy is normal and your TTG is not that high, then just monitor and see and make sure you're growing and no other symptoms. You're looking for other autoimmune diseases. There are other tests that can be done, like a video capsule can be done and so on. So there are many other tests that can be done. But I would say if your TTG is very high, don't ignore it. Get some more testing done.
Yeah,
with that.
That's fantastic. So, Dr. Abadie and Dr. Verma, in your expertise, are there other diseases? I know you talked about inflammation, but what about, are there other diseases that cause blunt villi besides celiac in your intestine?
Yes, there are many other conditions that cause blunt villi. So, in celiac disease, it's not just blunt villi. There are many other features to the biopsies that you're looking at that makes it celiac. If you have only blunt villi, there's many other things like bacterial overgrowth, H. pylori, giardia, other autoimmune diseases, post-viral, medications. If you take a lot of Advil, I can go through that. But there are many other things that can cause an blunting of the villi. So again, goes back to that TTG. If your biopsies are better than where they were before, what else is going on is what you want to look at. You have to look at the whole picture.
Yeah.
Was there viral illness or something like that? But there are other things besides celiac that can cause the blunted villi with that as well.
So, Dr. Verma, I want to, from your perspective, we have an amazing young audience here. How can they help drive research and get involved?
Call Dr. Abadie. No. I think, you first have to think about what is research in your mind. I think we use the word research so loosely, and I'm sure Dr. Abadie cringes every time we say research. So there is the research that's in the lab that obviously you have to do a lot more learning and studying and all that, but I'm sure there's stuff in the lab that you can help. But I think some of it can be promotion of what are the different trials. How can you get people, you're young, you have celiac disease, you drum up business and say, talk to people, get people involved in clinical trials. So that's research because you're helping with research. So that is one form of research. Or you have a question and you want to learn the answer. Like, for example, here at our center, I wanted to know if there are any clinical characteristics or biochemical or metabolic characteristics that are different for children diagnosed less than 5 years of age versus those diagnosed older. So that was a question, and then we did chart reviews, and hopefully we'll publish it someday, but that was something to look at. So it depends on, you can do research, getting involved and actually doing the research, but you got to go to school somewhere and get to know Dr. Abadie, that's in the lab. Or you can go and say, I want to do some chart reviews. I have a question. This is what I can do. Or you can join groups. You can join the center and say, I'd like to have some advocacy sessions where I talk to the community and I talk about how I can get people involved. I mean, that's how I can see from a clinical standpoint. But Dr. Abadie, what about in your opinion?
No, I think the last point is actually a really good point because, to do research, we need money. And so to have money, we write grants that can be funded by the NIH or other institution. And often what one could say, when you say you're working on celiac disease, people can tell you, what are you working on celiac disease? There's a cure, that's gluten-free diet. You don't need to find another cure, which is a big problem for us because, we need to convince people that it's worth what we're doing is worth it. So I think contributing to research is actually, as Dr. Verma said, advocating for your disease, saying out loud, how annoying it is, how constraining it is, and that you need us to do our job to make you better, So I think that's helping our research. If you guys do that, if you don't stay silent and you actually say, that's a problem, that's really, that's making our life harder. So that helps us. That will help us. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I know, just jumping off from that, Dr. Abadie, it was one time, a long time ago, a parent actually told me that the reason we don't have a lot of funding in celiac disease is because we teach our patients go on a gluten-free diet and life will be good. So we are very complacent about that. And I think that's where nobody then thinks about, funding for grants, funding for this. So even writing letters to the FDA, even if it is, if there are these open forums that happen and they invite comments from the public. I think those are, I didn't even think about that, but I think those are really excellent opportunities for everyone. So look around and see, there are these opening statements that come out, or you could just go to your congressperson and say, okay, you know what? Well, how can I work on to get more dollars so that Dr. Abadie and other people in the research world can get more grants to study more about celiac disease and other inflammatory conditions. We don't create noise in the world of celiac disease as patients. As patients, we sort of just accept, okay, I'm going to keep on reading labels and I'm going to go to the restaurant that allow me to do that. I'll be the quiet one. Or even if I make noise in the restaurant, it's only for that noise. But I think making noise in a bigger way, talking to the politicians, talking to those, that's really where the grants and all that come in, the NIH, the FDA, all of those people. So get involved with those when you have those opportunities to be able to go to the Hill or go somewhere or start something and say, I want to start this to fundraise for this. That's all research in my book.
Just talk about your disease,
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also want to plug another form of research is surveys. Sometimes centers like the Celiac Disease Center will send out a survey, and it really is to measure quality of life. And sometimes that has clinical outcomes. It impacts how we care for our patients. So participating even in the surveys, I know it takes a few minutes. They're not often, but that's another wonderful way that we do research that really does have an impact on our patients' quality of life, which is everyone. And we want to improve. I always just say our jobs are to support you, your family, and improve your life while we have people like Dr. Abadie and Dr. Verma looking for many different ways of, I like to say, cures, right? There are many different ways of a cure. But in the meantime, it is our job to support you and make some noise with Dr. Verma at World Congress and on the Hill. And but it is really important. So I want all of you to feel empowered that you can really make a difference. And it does impact actually research. It really does, because the more noise we make, the more funding there is allocated from the NIH and our different grants, even through the government, and they earmark funds, and sometimes it's for the noisiest bunch. So I think we need to empower ourselves as a young group of how to do that. But this was, I think this was a great discussion. I learned a lot. I love always, Dr. Abadie, hearing about all the work you do. It's hard because what you do is so complex, but it is so important. And Dr. Verma, always, we love having you on and talking to us. This was great. And Lindsay, thank you for pulling this together. Dr. Verma, do you have any closing thoughts? No?
No, but if anyone in the audience, last chance, any questions, anything at all, you can come off mute, speak up, anything. Ainsley, what's going on in life?
Not much. I do have a question though. I was just wondering if you guys had studied or like know about the effects of like how much gluten you eat on like kind of the brain fog or like the cyto I forgot the word, like that thing.
Cytokine storm.
Yeah.
How much gluten will give you those results? Is that what your question is,
So
Ainsley?
like how much like
Quantity.
if the amount of gluten you eat like affects like how bad like the cytokine storm is or like the brain fog symptoms are. Like if it's worse the more you eat.
I don't think that for everyone it's the same dose, um, because not everyone responds with symptoms, right? So there are some people who can eat a whole loaf of bread and not have any symptoms. So I don't know the exact amount, but I don't think it makes a difference how much gluten you're eating, whether it's one slice of bread or two slices of bread. That will give you the intensity of that symptom. I don't know the answer if it makes a difference to the cytokines. My guess would be yes, but Dr. Abadie, what do
I
you
would
think?
say the same. The thing that there's a dissociation between symptoms actually and what's going on at the level of the immune response. And for celiac, on the standpoint of the immune response, we know that quantity of cell matters. So gluten is the antigen, the thing against what your immune system is going to respond. So I would believe that the more antigen, the more gluten you have, the more cells you're going to activate. So that should have a more effect. But it's dissociated from symptoms. So we have to see it through different angle, actually. So I think both answers are correct. And I don't think that anybody had studied that. So there was I'm going back to read too, because I don't remember exactly the 3 grams, 6 gram of gluten for studies. I think it's been dosed just with 2 doses where some people, when they did gluten challenge, I found out that the 3 gram was safer for patient, sufficient to induce a response and being safer, damaging less the gut. So it's more a 3 gram standard. We do gluten challenge and it's really standardized where you have a precise amount of gluten you give to patient. We have an ongoing studies where we have muesli bar really with only exactly 3 grams of gluten. So I think it's been done like that, but it's never been done for brain fog or other study where it's very hard, with humans. I work with mice also, so with real people, it's very hard to do a dose response like that and assess. That would be challenging, actually, I believe, to do. So we can only speculate about what we know, what we think, but probably quantity is going to matter one way or another.
So definitely the response from a cytokine response will be there, but symptoms just don't seem to correlate all the time with the amount of gluten somebody gets. Symptoms are tough, and that's one of the reasons why the vaccine did not go through was just because they were looking more at a symptom endpoint rather than looking at a cytokine endpoint or something like that. And that was, again, a ruling that was there by the FDA, and that was part of the problem. One of the reasons why that whole vaccine did not work out is looking at symptoms. Did not seem to correlate with how much gluten you were getting. So Ainsley, it's a study for you to do.
I had a question. My daughter was diagnosed at 8 years old, and at that point of her diagnosis, I had been gluten-free for 6 years due to a Hashimoto's diagnosis. And I was told I need to gluten myself for weeks on end in order to get a diagnosis of celiac disease, but there's a high probability that I'm the genetic carrier. The studies that you're doing as far as the antigens, is it possible that in the future I can be tested with a diagnosis of celiac disease without glutening myself?
Well, not exactly. So I'm gonna try with Ritu, and then you can correct me. So, so there's a genetic predisposition. So, and we know that Hashimoto is actually one of the diseases that can happen at the same time as celiac, or conjointly with celiac, and there might be the same genetic determinant. What you can do if you want to see if you're the carrier, it's be at what we call an HLA typing, which is going to determine already if you carry HLA-DQ2 or DQ8. Because if your husband doesn't and you do, it's I can say that unequivocally, without a doubt, you're the one who would have transmitted it to your daughter, right? Then having a definite diagnosis of celiac disease without gluten challenge. Having been gluten-free for so many years, I don't think that it's possible. Right, Rachel? There will be no way that we can say, oh, you have antibody, antitrust gluten antibody mimic gluten exposure. So if you have antibody, you have disease, but if you're gluten-free, we're not going to detect this antibody. And tissue damage is induced by gluten. So if you're gluten-free, unless you're refractory to gluten-free diet, which is happens, but in that your case, I mean, it wouldn't make sense. It can be. So you can get HLA typing that would, but your husband should do it too. Like that, you're gonna know which one of you is the culprit.
Do we do that through like your primary physician, or do you just order a genotyping test online, or?
No, so Ritu, how would you do
You
for
have to
that?
get a blood test done, and it can be through your primary doctor if they know, but you have to just make sure that they specifically order HLA, DQ2, and DQ8. Because sometimes what happens is you go to a lab and get HLA. Most of the time they do the B27 because that's a more common one that everyone looks at. So you have to get specifically DQ2 and DQ8. So if you are negative for DQ2 and DQ8, the chance that you'll have celiac disease is minuscule. So then you've been on a gluten-free diet for no reason, or whatever reason, but not from a celiac standpoint. And if you have either DQ2 or DQ8, then you do have a chance, but it doesn't mean that you absolutely have celiac disease. So then you would need to have a gluten challenge. The question is, how long do you have to stay on a gluten challenge? So right now, yes, it's a few months, but hopefully the future will have other testing that can be done that may not require that long. But currently, yeah, that's what need to be done, hopefully in the future. But I think, as Dr. Abadie said, the first thing you probably want to do is know whether you are genetically susceptible or not, and pray that you are negative, that you can eat gluten and not worry. But if you're positive, you're in the same boat of whether you want to be challenged or not.
Yeah, I've attempted reintroducing gluten into my diet just merely for the test, and I have terrible symptoms. My skin breaks out, it becomes raw, terrible gut symptoms, headaches. So I think my body is just telling me, you don't get to have gluten. But it would be so nice just to know for certain without having to make myself sick to find out.
Right, right. And I think then, you want to look at a challenge very sort of methodically and almost scientifically. So you don't want to just challenge with bread because you could be reacting to many other things in the bread. So you probably need to talk to your whoever, gastroenterologist or primary doctor, in terms of how do you challenge. So we don't usually say go out and have a slice of pizza because there's a lot of stuff there that you could react to. So you want to have some sort of gluten, but start with a very small amount, and then see how you do. Because again, if someone has not had any food, it doesn't matter whether it's gluten or not, any particular food you haven't had for years, and then you introduce it, you may have some reaction that's not necessary that it is celiac related. So again, a very gradual introduction, but the genetic testing might be your first bet that you want to do.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And good luck on that journey. But if you're happy on a celiac gluten-free diet, then so be it.
Awesome. Well, not happy, but I feel better.
Right. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Makes a difference. Well, this was fantastic. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And I want to thank Dr. Abadie and Dr. Verma. And happy Celiac Awareness Month. I hope you guys do things, make some noise, raise some awareness for celiac disease, and please join us for future educational events. So,
Rachel, there was a question in the Q&A that we did not address.
Oh,
so,
yes, let me make sure.
Yeah, so I think
yes.
Willa, the answer to that is you really need to be evaluated. There's specific tests that need to be done, whether you have the dysautonomia or not. So there's specific blood pressures and things like that need to be done. So I would say in order to think that's what you have, that's the testing that needs to be done before you go down that journey.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Awesome to talk to all of you.
Very welcome.
So glad you joined us. Thank you. I'm sorry. I don't know. I must have had the window down. I apologize, Willa. Thank you. Thank you all. All right. Go enjoy. If you're in Chicago, it's beautiful. Go enjoy the weather. And thank you guys. And it was good to see familiar faces on here. Thank you all for coming. Have a great night.